One of your questions reminded me, someone just said what they're going to put on my tombstone, and I felt like tombstone was probably too morbid for this conversation, but my epitaph would be, wherever he went, he changed. Sure. Tim Peck. I was the founder of Call9, telemedicine company, and then now I'm the founder of Curve Health, another telemedicine company that's used the technology from Call9 to be able to treat patients in nursing homes and scaling across the country. So the mission remains the same. Everything that's motivated me has come from this moment that I've tried to center around, which is the moment that you go from becoming a person to a patient. And no matter how successful you are in life as that person, you're all of a sudden thrust into a system that's so much bigger than you, that is not made for you, that you feel lost in your medical record number suddenly. And it's made the healthcare system as we know it in the US, but really everywhere, is made for the systems themselves, their own viability and their own feasibility to be able to do what they do. And the user's desirability gets buried from it, right? It's you sit in a waiting room, you are a number to people, it's all about you coming to them, etc. And so started to think about these vulnerable moments of people and how we can be with them. And this was very early teens, started to look into telemedicine. This before the world really was using telemedicine. Less than 1% of doctors had ever used telemedicine. Most people, even in medicine, didn't even know what that term meant. It didn't have a real meaning to people. They thought it was a telephone. And so from there, made a company called Call9 to be with people at the moment of their emergency, right? This very moment where all of a sudden they were a patient and they've converted into, they were a person and they converted into a patient. And so made a telemedicine company as well as a physician group. I'm a physician myself, New Yorker, went to NYU for med school here, went up to Harvard for residency, stayed on this faculty, left that whole thing to do Y Combinator 2015, that journey, be in Silicon Valley and create a company. And so made a physician group myself, and we treated patients in nursing homes through telemedicine when they were having emergencies. The reason we picked nursing homes is because about 20% of patients who come to the emergency department in the US in an ambulance originate from nursing homes. So it's the #1 largest place where people are coming from. So we started there to find these people who are having emergencies, made a system that treated those patients, kept a whole bunch of people out of the hospital who unnecessarily were going, saved the insurance companies, Medicare, the government, hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. And we entered into contracts with the insurance companies, et cetera, to reap the benefits of that as well, and together increase the quality. However, Medicare, which is the piece of the government that pays for those people over 65 for their healthcare needs, and thus what we were doing, had no mechanism of paying for telehealth in general, especially telehealth, doing emergency care on telehealth into a nursing home in non-rural areas, in urban areas. This just was not part of the code, it was not part of the law. So I found myself, because we had so much data of how effective what we were doing was, how it saved billions of dollars if it were to be scaled across the country for Medicare, I found myself to be kind of the poster boy for this, and was in DC and got to testify before Congress, trying to change the law. and helping write bills to try to change the law. A bill was introduced to Congress that we wrote, and it was all ready to go forward, and then in 2019 the government shut down for the longest it ever had, and nothing really happened in telemedicine or health tech for about a year. So we shut the company down at that time. We were spending cash to be able to grow, and that cut off the spigot for us, and so put the technology on the shelf to say, let's play another day. Let's continue to do the advocacy work, change the laws, because we knew it was good for patients, we knew it was good for the economy, and good for innovation. We could push the whole industry toward this. And so little did we know, less than a year later, the pandemic would hit. Who could predict? And so in March of 2020, and March, April, everything was changed in terms of the laws and the regulations that we needed to make that business work, like overnight. and largely because a lot of the work that we did, we meaning thousands of people together trying to make those changes beforehand, it could happen very quickly. There was a whole innovation industry around it. And when that happened, we took the technology from Call9, rebranded it into Curve, and because telemedicine went from, at this point, about 17% of doctors using telemedicine to overnight 85% of doctors using telemedicine on a daily basis, we no longer needed our own physician group, and instead made a platform to sell to other physician groups to use to do telemedicine into nursing homes. And that's what's called Curve Health. Hired out an executive team, got it back up and running, redid the project, the product a bit to meet these new use cases, and raised a couple rounds of quick funding, and off to the races. It's scaling across the country. May 2019 is when we closed, and it was March 2020 when it opened. So about 10 months, 9 months. The first thing I thought of was the employees. So we had already had to do a big reduction in force as we were preparing for this, as we saw that the bill wasn't going to go through and anytime soon the rules weren't going to change. And so that was really hard. I made no promises that this would work as a leader. In fact, we were doing something so different, so forward, I would say to people, like, this could all go away, right? Like, what we're doing is pushing forward. It's high risk. It's a startup that's high risk. It'll be huge reward should we push this off. Even so, people gave themselves to the mission. And we created an amazing mission around doing right by the patient first, and everything else would fall into place. And so they were believers, right? And then all of a sudden they were asked on that first reduction in force, and then at the day that we closed, to that they wouldn't have not just the job, but they wouldn't have this mission to continue that they put so much of themselves into. And that was hard. And I had to stand up in front of the company and deliver that message. We had 220 people at the height of it, probably about 120 or so at the time when we closed. Yeah. So for one, we named, and I say we because we made a founding team based off of some of the people that made Call9 what it was, right? I didn't go from scratch and hire a completely different team. There were people who were on the mission, and so many advocates for us. So one, we named the company Curve because we were ahead of the curve with Call9. We knew what needed to be done here for the world with a lot of other advocates, and it seemed like it also had the double entendre of being, at the time, everybody was talking about flattening the curve in COVID. So it worked well, but it really came from being too far ahead of the curve at first, now we're at a point where we're right on the curve, the right place for the adoption curve, and making it. What it would mean is that millions of people who otherwise would not receive care can receive care. And it's not just receiving care, it's saving people's lives. So my mentor, when I left Harvard, said to me, I was struggling, should I really be doing this, And he said to me, if you leave, someone else is going to teach these residents, someone else is going to work in this emergency department and save those lives. The next day, they'll bring someone else in. But if you stay, no one is going to be pushing forward with the ideas that you're coming up with right now, and people will die. And so that was a big responsibility to have and think through. July 15th, 2015 was when we saw our first patient. His name was Mr. D. He was a nursing home patient in his 80s, had some vague abdominal discomfort. And the nursing home, typically what would happen is they'd kind of pick up the phone, the nurses would pick up the phone, talk to a doctor, say, hey, this is what's going on with the patient. And so that happened. They said, let's give him, give him some, essentially, medicine for constipation. Go back to bed. We'll see him in the morning. So that was the first patient we saw. And so I saw him through telemedicine, and I saw the first 1,000 patients or so. And so I saw him through telemedicine, and he was a bit short of breath. I could see from his medical records that he was diabetic. And shortness of breath, diabetes, vague abdominal discomfort equals heart attack until proven otherwise for an emergency physician. And so we did an EKG with our system and could in fact see that he was having a heart attack. And we had his vitals and his oxygen was dropping because his lungs started to fill up with fluid. Put an IV in him, gave him the aspirin, and we're able to transport him to the emergency department right away. And he left the hospital 3, 4, 5 days later with just a little bit of his heart function decreased, 5%. And I have a video of visiting him afterwards, and he just thanked us for saving his life. And if we didn't do that, he would have died, right? And that whole family has been a huge part of my life since. It's such a testament to what we could do, and since have seen hundreds of thousands of thousands of patients doing the same type of care for them. So what this would mean for curve working, for pushing forward the industry in general, that we can bring care to people rather than people to care through telemedicine, novel models. With a bunch of other entrepreneurs doing that, together we've created a new model that reaches people at their most vulnerable moments when they otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. And that wouldn't happen if people didn't take chances and do these startups. The incumbents aren't going to do this without being pushed by what we're doing. It's lonely at times, very lonely at times. Sharing your, I try to lead through vulnerability. It's a big belief of mine that to have a high-performing team, the team members need to be able to tell one another what they think immediately without sugarcoating it, without going around, so that we can move fast and we can learn fast. And to do that means being open about yourself, your failures, who you are, your successes, so that the other person can know you, and therefore they'll be more vulnerable to open themselves up so you can know them. And it's my job to model that for people. However, to the outside world in startups, that rarely comes off very well. To potential investors, to potential partners, etc. Sure, you can say where you need to grow and as a company, etc. But something's always on fire in a startup. And sharing that with people who don't know how that feels scares them off immediately. Because if it's not one thing, it's another thing is going to be on fire. Someone's leaving your company and they're critical to it. Some experiment or MVP that you put together just didn't work. Some customer walked away and you were relying on them. All of these things happen, and you scramble to make up for it and learn from it and make new things, but externally not so much. So, and as you grow as a company, it gets bigger and bigger, and there's a lot of eyes on you, and everything you're kind of doing is, from your mannerisms to the decisions you make, the big decisions you make are under a magnifying glass. And so, maintaining that vulnerability becomes something that kind of gets you through the moments, because if you don't and completely close up, it eats at you. And so you have your team to be vulnerable with, but you don't necessarily have the outside world. You can't really show exactly what's going on in your life and in your business life, because then you scare certain people away. Yeah. Yeah, I certainly have gone out of balance in the past. I've learned from going out of balance how to stay in balance. I actually, to get vulnerable about this, I had so much stress at one point that I went into something called atrial fibrillation with my heart, which happens from stress, where the top chambers of the heart just aren't working right. They're kind of bouncing around, makes you short of breath, dizzy, etc. I remember when it first happened, I was in the Call 9 office in Brooklyn and actually laid down on the floor, and someone brought over an EKG to check it and saw it. And it's something that's dangerous and something that just needed to be taken care of. I had to have a surgery to take care of it. And that was a big wake-up call to say, okay, you need to be able to have stress relief and share what's going on with your loved ones more, and started talking to my family a whole lot more about what was happening in my life every day, what these stresses were like. And I always wanted to keep it to myself because I didn't want to put it on them, that things like having to fire someone, an individual. And in startups, they become your friends, they become your family, and you have to let go of someone that eats at you, etc. And so just sitting in bed with that rather than kind of talking to your wife about it, you internalize the stress so much, and I internalized it so much that I had this heart issue. So now I share a lot more with the people in my life. I think so. Yeah, I should have done it a long time ago. So I, with my co-founder, raised money out of Y Combinator for the first company for Call 9. That was a very different experience than doing it alone, kind of without that demo day environment, without that extra team to kind of hype it up. So when Curve came around and we needed money immediately because the pandemic hit, I did two things. One, I incubated the company at IDEO, the kind of world's leading design innovation firm. So actually incubated there, and they helped with changing the product, etc. And that was pretty amazing to be able to get a team together for that. And then I went to investors who had invested in us before at Call 9, who believed in me personally, and who I'd kept in touch with about this mission, and was able to raise very quickly from them. It was Lightspeed Ventures. Dr. Ling Wang is her name, who led the round. And so Yeah, the major difference was that I was running the process, and I knew how to run the process because I'd raised a bunch of rounds beforehand, rather than in that first company with Y Combinator. I was trying to learn everything from other people and even taking advice that I didn't know if it would be right or wrong from people because I'd never done it before. So getting reps at fundraising, it then becomes easy. One of the rounds in this company, rounds are different. Sometimes there's a frenzy of activity. Other times it's not as much of a frenzy. And just knowing, and now at this point, I know and believe that I know how to do it, that I'm surrounded by the right people, that it'll happen. Even if it's harder, even as one of those harder rounds, more difficult, I know at the end it will occur. So that also takes away a ton of that stress that we talked about. You can sleep a lot better at night, knowing that you can trust in yourself that the company will remain and the mission will remain going forward. What now looks like a good fundraising strategy? So, number one, if it's not a fit, not stating anything about you personally, or your company even. Oftentimes you'll find an investor who you think is a great fit, but they just had 3 investments, and they need to slow down, or it doesn't quite meet their investment thesis that they have sold to their LPs who invest in them. And that's not your fault, including maybe you'll meet an investor who got in a fight with their spouse that day, right? And they're coming with different energy than they normally would. It's not your fault, that's not you. And so you need to speak to a lot of people, because even the right matches with a company is also, the VC is also around timing because of that. And so you're not looking for just one perfect match. You're looking for a number of them, because one of them will then be a good match in where they are in their own life cycle. And so just keeping your head up and constantly talking and not getting down with the no's, because you can contextualize where those no's are coming from better, has just immensely helped me through the fundraising process. Yeah. Change is possible. And as I started this interview, healthcare has a systems issue. It doesn't have a heart issue. Plenty of people who have given up their smart abilities to go become, an eye banker instead, or a doctor. Plenty of nurses who work extra hours and give themselves, especially in this COVID environment, certainly doesn't have a heart issue. It has, and so therefore it's not a people problem that healthcare works so poorly. It's an operations problem. It's a systems issue. And so what Call9 Curve legacy is showing that a system, you don't have to do it the way it's always been done. You can do it a different way. It can be successful. People can get better care. It can be done more inexpensively, and there's businesses that can be built around it. And being a beacon of that, especially not only healthcare, but in nursing homes, where it's a corner of healthcare that is devoid of innovation in many ways. Showing that innovation could happen in those worlds, I hope can be a beacon to show that it can happen in other worlds. Go to www.curvehealth.com is our website. You can always look me up on LinkedIn as well, and I'm pretty responsive there.